Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in a few minutes. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our Cheng School panel event, Combating Burnout, Strategies for Mental Wellness. My name is Truc Nguyen, and I'm the Manager of Storytelling and Strategy at the Cheng School. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the land on which Toronto Metropolitan University is built upon. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I want to pay my respects to the Indigenous peoples, elders, and ancestors who stewarded and cared for nature and the people who lived on the land where TMU is located today. At the university, we have made a deep and long-lasting commitment to truth and reconciliation. I invite you to learn more about this work online. Now, I'd like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. Your microphone is muted throughout the event so as not to disturb other attendees or the presenters. We are also striving to create an accessible space for all and recognize the ways that anyone, regardless of disability status, might benefit from accessibility features. As such, we have an automated captioning available, which you can activate in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's panelists by typing them into the chat box of the control panel. And finally, please note that the information provided during this event is for general information purposes only. So before we kick off today's panel, I would like to introduce Gary Hepburn, Dean at the Cheng School of Continuing Education. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you, Truc. Thank you for the introduction, Truc. On behalf of the Cheng School, I'm pleased to welcome each of you to this afternoon's important discussion. For many of us, the winter months can be challenging for our mental wellness. The shorter days and colder weather can heighten feelings of stress and isolation, which can lead themselves to burnout. Toronto Metropolitan University is committed to fostering an environment that supports mental wellness. The TMU Mental Health and Wellbeing Committee consists of students, staff, and faculty members who meet on a regular basis to consider the development of new principles and resources and events to promote mental well-being awareness and support for all community members. As TMU students, Cheng School learners have access to a variety of helpful resources that support mental wellness. Some of these services include the Center for Student Development and Counseling, which offers confidential counseling services from their team of psychologists, social workers, and psychotherapists. Health promotion programs that engage in advocacy, awareness, and education, and include peer support groups. And the Thrive TMU initiative, which provides student training and resources rooted in the principles of positive psychology. One of the many Thrive TMU services include weekly virtual and in-person mood route walks hosted over the lunch hour. I encourage you to take advantage of these valuable resources and to share them with your peers. Should you need accommodation or guidance, please don't hesitate to speak with your instructors or a Cheng School staff member. We are all here to support you. This afternoon, we are joined by 3 expert panelists who will offer their insight in combating burnout and share strategies for maintaining mental wellness. I'd like to thank each of them for joining us. I will now turn the floor back to Truc to introduce the panelists. Thank you to everyone for attending.
Thank you, Dean Hepburn. Now, I would like to introduce our panelists for the event, Dr. Jenny Liu, Siobhan Stewart, and Dr. Jillian Strudwick. Welcome to our panelists. To get started, can you each briefly introduce yourself? Dr. Liu, if you could start.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Jenny Liu. I am an associate with the McDonald Franklin OSI Research Center. We're a research center that focuses very much on veteran and military mental health. And I'm an adjunct research professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Schulich School of Medicine at Western University. And I also am a lecturer in the Department of Psychology at TMU here.
Perfect. Thank you. Siobhan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Great. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Siobhan Stewart, and I am a staff here at TMU. I work with the Student Experience Center. I'm a Faculty of Arts as the Black Student Success Facilitator. That's one of my things. I also work as a caregiver to a senior in the community who has custody of her 2 grandchildren. And I also work in the financial services industry as well, teaching people about financial literacy, financial independence, and becoming, the director of your own life in that area.
Thank you and welcome. Dr. Sedgwick?
Thank you so much for the wonderful invitation. So it's great to be here with my fellow panelists and each of you. My name is Jillian Strudwick. I work at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, which depending on where you're at today could be down the street from where you're located. I have a couple of different hats. One is I'm a mental health nurse. So of course this topic is near and dear to my heart, mental wellness. I'm a scientist researching topics as they relate to burnout, particularly when it comes to technology use in the health setting. And then I have an administrative hat as the Chief Clinical Informatics Officer, so all the tech sort of stuff that we use in the hospital environment. And all of that, I imagine, will come into our conversation as we carry on throughout this afternoon.
Truck, sorry, one last thing I just wanted to introduce to the room. In a previous world, I served as the first Black woman at the McMaster student, as president of the McMaster Student Union. And during that time, I created a service called the Peer Support Line, which was run by a variety of different university and community staff members that trained 50 students to facilitate the line. So it was a peer support resource. And as well, in that time, I also established the 3rd fall break for students in Ontario. Now it's become a bit more common, but many of you may or may not have known that TMU was one of the first 2 to actually take a lead on student mental health and create more, alleviate some of the stress in the fall term. So I just wanted to bring that into the dialogue as well.
Thank you so much. So welcome again. And I guess, just to jump right in, one of the first things that we were thinking about when we were planning this panel was, what is burnout and how is it different from fatigue or stress? Because I think we read a lot about burnout in the media and we hear about it, but a lot of us don't really know the difference, or if there is a difference. So
perhaps I'll start if that's okay, Truck.
No, that'd be perfect. Thank you.
So there are a couple of different definitions of burnout that exist out there, but most of them have a couple of common elements to these definitions. So these are that burnout is usually described as a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion that could be caused by either excessive or prolonged stress. And while it's related to what you said, fatigue and stress, it's not the same thing. And these things usually manifest a little bit differently. So stress tends to be manifested in more of a hyperactive or overreactive way. And I think we probably know what fatigue looks like, but for burnout, we tend to see more disengagement or perhaps a sense of hopelessness or loss of motivation or hope. So burnout is not depression. So I will acknowledge that it's not depression, but it can lead to depression. So I want to point that out. I will also just say that While burnout is a serious mental wellness concern, and that's why we're having this whole conversation today, it is not listed in what physicians use, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, to characterize it as an official mental disorder in the eyes of, say, a physician. But it's certainly something we need to take very seriously. And then I know this whole conversation today is about really taking it seriously, understanding why it happens and what we can do about it.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that sort of primer. I guess there are so many different forms of burnout that adults face. Can you speak to the most common forms of burnout that we face and what the best ways to recognize the symptoms of each type? For example, overload burnout or neglect burnout. Dr. Studgwick.
So I promise not to hog the microphone here, but I'll take this one as well. So there's a really interesting Harvard Business Review article that describes 3 common types of burnout. And so the first one being overload burnout, which is the most common form. The second one being underchallenged burnout, and the third being neglect burnout. And what I thought I might do is just describe what each of those these are, and then give you a couple of signs to watch out for if you're thinking about whether that's something that you might be feeling yourself. And so with regards to overload burnout, it's really about when you're working harder and more frantically to achieve success, often to the detriment of things like your personal life or your health. And so things to watch out for are things like, are you overlooking your own needs to fulfill, say, a work demand? Do you feel like you're investing more than is actually healthy to be able to commit or meet your career ambitions? So that's the first one. The second one being under challenge burnout. And so it might be a bit of surprise to find out that burnout can actually result from being from either doing too little or feeling under challenged. And it could be the opposite of what I just described in the other type. But things to watch out for this type of burnout are things like you would like to do work on additional assignments that are more challenging. So you want to be challenged, but you're not feeling challenged. You feel your job doesn't give you opportunities to develop your skill sets, or your current role is hampering your ability to advance and grow your talents. And so that's the second one. And now the third one is something called neglect burnout, and it's also called the worn out kind of burnout. And so this occurs when you aren't really given enough structure or direction or guidance in the workplace. So it could be difficult then to keep up with, say, the demands of your particular role. And so the kinds of things to watch out for you and yourself are things like you stop trying when work situations don't go as planned. You give up in response to, say, obstacles or things that might set you back. Or you feel demoralized when you wake up in the morning and you really don't feel like you want to face another day in that work environment. And so I know you're probably thinking, well, how do I actually prevent all these? And I'm not going to go there yet, because I know we're going to get into that in a few minutes.
Perfect. And I just want to chime in a little bit here as well, after what Jillian said about, where is burnout in the context of mental illness and its disorders. So you might be wondering, if it's not a mental disorder, right, and we talk about it, how do we contextualize it? How might we better understand it? And I want to take this opportunity to maybe introduce the dual continuum so that we can better position how do we understand burnout in the context of mental health. So we often think of health and mental health as, this duality or this dichotomy, like you're either healthy or you're ill, right? And the reality of the situation is much like sorry, that was my dog jumping. Try to prevent these things, but they always happen. But the reality is, with any chronic illness or with any diagnosis, or say if you have a sprained arm or a broken leg, you would still be able to function and flourish, right? You would still be able to pursue goals and right, and achieve things in life despite or with certain diagnoses or certain kinds of conditions. And it's very much the case with mental health as well, is that we can still achieve things and aim for things and strive for goals in our lives and flourish with or without a diagnosis of any mental disorders or illness. But the burnout is really on that spectrum or that axis that is really focusing on that functionality or our ability to flourish. And so on the one end of it, we might have that flourishing, that resiliency where we're able to accomplish all of our goals. And then on the very kind of bottom of that continuum is what we have burnout, which is inability to or languishing in our everyday lives. And so it's really this dual continuum where on one axis you have things like health and illness, and then the other axis where it's really speaking to our ability to function in our roles and in our capacities.
Thank you so much. I guess, I'm going to just jump on to our next question because I think Dr. You can speak to it. But what are some of the factors that can contribute to burnout?
Absolutely. So we touched a little bit on this earlier in terms of what burnout looks like and, in terms of exhaustion, fatigue. And so there are some individual factors, if you will, that contribute to burnout, which is workload, right? How much you're taking on in your everyday jobs, in your everyday roles. But a greater part of a contributing factor to burnout is perceived support in your roles, right? So perceived sense of meaning, sense of purpose, connection to your roles and to the work that you're doing. So for example, do you feel supported by your organization or by your institution? Do you feel like what you're doing is meaningfully contributing? And so those are some of the factors that really connect us to the work that we're doing. And if we don't feel connected to that work, that's when we start to see kind of the toll on us. We see the mental and physical exhaustion, and also we see that distancing in terms of wanting to be detached from our roles. And it's really coming from that connecting piece. Otherwise, oftentimes when that exhaustion hits, it looks a lot more like compassion fatigue.
Thank you so much. I guess, compassion fatigue, that's a new term to me, but I've been hearing a little bit about empathy and compassion burnout. Sort of, what is that exactly? And, how can someone identify if that's something that they're experiencing?
Absolutely. So visually, what compassion fatigue and empathy and compassion burnout often looks like, it looks very similar to burnout, right? It on the surface, you have someone that perhaps is caregiving, taking care of their ailing parents, right? Day in, day out, they've got to wake up at a certain time, feed their parents, change them and get them in the shower and then do all these things day in, day out, every single day. And at some point, things that happen and they can't even care anymore. It's like, oh, this new diagnosis, or there's this new treatment. Oh, this person is not feeling so well today. And they can't muster the response. It's like this lack of empathy, or it's this lack of being able to respond to any new information. They're completely burned out or completely exhausted to the point where there's no longer a capacity to respond to this new information. And so that is what typically looks like compassion burnout or compassion fatigue on the outside looking in. And so from a sort of stress responsivity point of view, what it is really is that when you're constantly reacting to things, you're actually wearing out your body systems. And so that leads to the wear and tear of all of your body because it's constantly mobilizing resources, constantly using up your body systems. And so at some point, you're going to run on steams and you're going to not have any more resource to respond to new information. And so from outside, it might look like apathy. It looks like someone who no longer cares. And it's not because they don't want to, they simply no longer have the capacity to be able to respond.
So I just wanted to thank you so much, Dr. Jenny, and Dr. Jillian, but I just wanted to kind of take a quick step back before we move into the next sort of questions, just for, people who are tuning in today. When I heard about this panel being offered, I put my hand up to be a panelist because I think the conversation specifically around mental health, particularly around burnout, anxiety, depression, coming out of the last 2 to 3 years in a very, you know, challenging social climate for all of us to be experiencing lockdowns and concerns about getting sick, very sick with COVID, or taking care of loved ones and all of that. Wherever you are located in this conversation, I thought it was really important for me as somebody who identifies as a young person, but every day that's just ticking away. I thought it was very important for me also as a Black woman and as a racialized person to put my hand up and share a little bit about my story and share a little bit about, and have the courage to personalize professional zones. And I think that, in doing so, that can allow anybody who's on this call, wherever you're located, if you hear something of yourself in my story, I hope that it empowers you and really allows you to, see what's possible. So I think for me in particular, on a lot of different levels as a young person, I'm 32 now, but when I was, in my undergrad and in graduate school, I definitely experienced burnout, and didn't really have the tools or the wherewithal and the consciousness, or gave myself the permission to take a step back and take a break. Because I think, something that can happen, especially in conversations with, if we're bringing an equity, diversity, and inclusion lens, and looking at really the social climate, I think for folks that have different identities that exist on different access of identity in the human experience, I think at times it can definitely be really challenging to persist, and also meet our own needs while also meeting the needs of others. And so I went through, Dr. Jillian went through the different stages of burnout that people can experience, whether that's being like overworked, and correct me if I get the terms wrong, Dr. Jillian, that's why you guys are here. The clinical experts, I got the lived experience. We're balancing each other out. But with regards to the different levels of burnout, I was super involved, over involved. I was a high achiever, high performer at a younger period in time. And then throughout my mid-20s to my late 20s, I definitely think that I went through a period of what Dr. Jillian referred to as like underwhelmed burnout, where I was working at a group home. I felt like I was really systemically like left out of a lot of opportunities, even though I had some of the skills to be contributing to the environment. I found it very difficult to get active employment, like in comparison to some of my peers. That was very demoralizing for me because I felt like I had gone from being a leader in one environment, and then when it came into going into the professional world, I felt like there was no space for me. I remember feeling as though I was working part-time at one location, and I worked for 2 years as a relief staff. And once I got a contract, they changed the rules where like you couldn't have benefits if you didn't work a certain amount of hours. And so, there was just this constant feeling and feeling of underappreciation of what I had to offer as a person, let alone my lived experiences and the value that's added as a Black life, as a woman, as a young woman, the particular strain as well that, when we talk about caregiving fatigue, part of a creative solution that I created to really be able to live in the city and live in Toronto was I looked at another area of life that was really important to me. And that's like really looking at our youth and our elders. And I happened to come across a senior in the community. I got connected to her through a couple of degrees of separation, and she was at risk of her children going into foster care, her grandchildren going into foster care. And many of you may or may not know this, but Black and Indigenous children are 4 times more likely than their white counterparts to go into the system. And the reasons for that, there are studies that have been done on this. Particularly, there's a project that's being done through the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies. It's a project called the One Vision, One Voice Project. But what they looked at is that, statistically speaking, instances of abuse are not any higher than with white populations. And so then that has us look like, what are the factors that are actually leading to this? And so, what they found is systemic racism, bias, all of those different factors contribute to our Black identified children, Indigenous children going into care. And so, sometimes when I was looking at it, systematically speaking, it doesn't really serve children. Studies have shown it's in their best interest for them to be closer to kin, right? Or stay closer to kin. And so, rather than waiting for the system to do something about it, I said to myself, what, I'm a single person. I personally have a value that I don't want to see more Black kids go into care. I'm going to put my hand up and be the caregiver. And so I've been living with them now for 2 years. And the benefit of that is these kids are now with their mother, their grandmother. They didn't have their life disrupted. And the benefit to me as someone in community is that I have housing. I have the ability to be connected in a community like this. The opportunity in this job here really came out of my commitment to be able to stay close to the family. And so, sometimes though, what I have noticed is just some of the challenges that it can be to do grassroots initiatives outside of the system and trying to find community-oriented solutions. And so, that in itself can be very challenging because, I've never been a parent before. That's completely new. And there's not really many people that exist that are like me, that are not formally a foster parent, formally in a lot of different ways, but that's often the kind of coping mechanisms that folks that have dealt with burnout tend to find, is some type of creative solution to still make it, to still survive, to still say, my dreams are important. Even if somebody has closed the door, I'm going to create a new one. And so, sorry if I'm getting emotional.
No. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your story. And I think that it's a really important part of the conversation, because I think you've really touched on 2 of the things that we've discussed, is that, there's many different types of burnout, and that, people may be experiencing different types and different stressors at different times in your life. So it's not just like, oh, you're only doing one type because, that's it. And then the other thing that I think that you brought up kind of really relates to what Dr. Liu was saying about, kind of the axis, was sort of that you can be sort of high functioning, but still feel burnt out or still be experiencing the impacts of burnout. So I think we'll definitely get into this a little bit more in terms of like strategies and sort of your tips, with your lived experience as well. But just, to sort of keeping an eye on the time, we want to go on to sort of talking about, obviously, this is an event for Chang School students and alumni and staff. Virtual school and work environments, do they present specific challenges when it comes to mental wellness? I'm going to start with you, Siobhan, if you have any thoughts on this.
I definitely would say yes. And so, it's interesting because, and there's different layers to sort of look at this, in some ways, the virtual environment creates access to students that may have a difficult time physically being here in person outside of the classes that they're required to. Because what I've found in the population that I've been serving, and a lot of students that I've been serving, many of them are mature students. They may have children. They may have, I can think of 2 students right now that are caring for sick parents, right? So that's doctor's appointments, that's clinical visits, that's going to the pharmacy. There's a lot of coordination that people have. So virtual environments can provide a certain level of accessibility. Now, the limitation I find is that in some ways, the cost is the connectivity, right? You know, people being together in person, you know, and I think the doctors on here can kind of speak to if there's a chemical benefit to being like, you know, or social benefit and how human beings interact to being in person, but sometimes it can still contribute to a bit of the alienation if someone is not necessarily putting themselves in a new physical environment to be with new people. And also, you know, it has the undergrad or the graduate experience or the post-grad experience sort of live in a digital realm as opposed to like a physical beingness realm that traditionally we've leaned on when we think about what builds an effective co-curricular experience or experiential layer to someone's full career as a student. And so I think that it's good in some ways, I think, but at the same time, you know, the connection piece and the kind of work and the intimacy that can be built in smaller groups that are held like in session, there's a drawback there. And I'm curious what the other folks would like to say on that.
I'm happy to chime in here. So I agree with everything that Siobhan, you've just mentioned about the challenges, right? It's like quality over quantity. And what happens when we switch to virtual environments, and especially without a lot of infrastructural support, without a lot of prior planning, right? It kind of all happened. No one was preparing for that. No one was expecting that. And so that sets up a lot of violations of expectations. You expected your school career to look a certain way. You expected to make all these connections. You expected to attend all of these things in person, to meet people, to talk to people, to really live that life. And instead you get something else that very much violated all of your expectations. And so that in and of itself becomes a source of stress. And I talked earlier about one of the contributing factors to burnout being that lack of feeling supported or lack of sense of meaning and purpose and connection of your role to like the larger environment, to the larger organization. And so, right, you have what is really a perfect storm of breeding that context, right? You know, you're sitting behind a computer, very much physically disconnected from the world. Right. And you're like, this is what my school life is supposed to be like, who is this person, you know, teaching me things? Like, where are my classmates? What are they like? I can't see them. They're just names, right? On a black square or behind Zoom. And like, I can't connect to them, especially with lecture formats, and you're not really engaging, you're not really talking. And so all of this speaks to us not being able to form that meaningful connection and then develop that sense of meaning and purpose in our roles. And so that accompanied by all of these new challenges, right? Like adapting to new coursework virtually, not being able to get the support, not being able to talk to your professors face to face, you know, lining up, greeting them, and all of those things. That's really is the perfect storm for burnout, right? Because we're dealing with stress after stress. It's not for lack of caring. And one thing I want to point out too is that we see burnout a lot more in individuals who are kind of champions and have the high capacity and high function and the willpower to do things to make change. And it's precisely that factor that sometimes also make them at risk for burnout, because they are the ones at the front lines for championing change. And when they don't see that, or when they feel disenfranchised or feel that lack of support, that's when it can become, you know, extra stressful and can contribute to the overall burnout experience.
Thank you. And thank you, both of you, for speaking about, you know, sort of the challenges that virtual work environments and virtual, you know, a school could be. We'll sort of circle back to this later when we talk about strategies, and we can speak to, you know, strategies specifically for improving our virtual interactions and work. But, you know, my next question is kind of more related to what Siobhan was saying before. And So in 2021, HUE, a nonprofit organization dedicated to building equity, prosperity for Black, Indigenous, and people of color or BIPOC communities, released a report called A State of Inequity, Unsafe, Unheard, Unvalued. And one of the key findings in this report was that BIPOC employees report experiencing higher levels of burnout at work. Can you speak a little bit more on this topic and provide advice for BIPOC individuals that are experiencing burnout due to discrimination or other factors? Anyone can speak. So
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
Siobhan, do you
thank
want to
you.
start?
Yeah, sure. So, you know, I'm certainly not surprised by the findings of this report. I'm glad that, you know, this kind of research is starting to be a bit more front and center. And I also want to just acknowledge the work that's been currently done and is still being done at TMU to, you know, address these sorts of inequities. I know in I believe it's in 2020, there was an anti-Black campus climate report, anti-Black racism campus climate report that was conducted as well, that surveyed, you know, Black staff and students on campus. Actually, my role within the Faculty of Arts got established out of that report, where students identified and staff identified the need for more, you know, specified resources. And so I think, you know, there's a lot of different nuances that contribute to this. I think one, in general, you know, women are generally make less money than men. There's a lot of unseen and unpaid labor, time and emotional energy that's given, that I think structurally in many different environments, not just higher education, but structurally as a society in many different environments, it is what's often undervalued. And the impact then is less resources to nourish ourselves to then continue to give back, right? I think as well, you know, different elements in which you can experience higher burnout at work is, you know, understanding the issue and the challenge. And this is not just with myself, this is with learning and collaborating with different colleagues since I've been here for just under 6 months, right? It's understanding that you can see the challenges of what needs to be done or what people are facing, or you have students coming and sharing with you what they're dealing with. And then you only have like a small amount of hours to address so many different things. And we're also coming into a period in climate on campus where even upper year students aren't familiar with the territory because they weren't here physically for the beginning part of their degrees. And so there's just sometimes this gap of knowledge. There's a growing pain right now in fostering like the next set of leaders and folks that people can sort of turn to. There's a lot of new folks on campus that are new in their roles and new different initiatives that are kind of sprouting. And so I think that, you know, the advice that I can give specifically is one, find, if you're in a work environment, find a peer, whether they are BIPOC identified or not, you know, because I do have some really great colleagues that identify as white, but are strong allies and advocates, and really, you know, it's not just the inclusion dialogue that it's like real action that they put behind it, that you feel like you can talk to and debrief with. I think that's really, really important. I think as well, if you have a good relationship with your supervisor, I'm very privileged that I have two, I mean, I'm so loyal to this department because I like my supervisors so much. That is a huge piece. And if you don't feel like your supervisor is a safe person to have these kind of conversations, you know, I think that it's important to advocate for yourself and do it safely, but to, you know, have this be a learning opportunity for that person, because, you know, it contributes to what Dr. Jillian was saying before, that can happen in your work environments of a type of burnout when you don't feel like you have the support, you don't feel like you have the resources that you need to do your job, and so you can disengage, right? And so I think that would be probably contributing like a result that would contribute negatively to what Hugh is describing in the report you're sharing about. And I think another part as well is, you know, dealing with the guilt that can come from when we can't necessarily do everything that we'd like to be able to do, right? I know sometimes, and that can be something that kind of takes energy away from a pool of energy that already the experience was that it's limited. And so I think, you know, one of the practices that I put in place every day, I try to look at what's something that I'm grateful for and I have gratitude for, and also one thing that I did really well and one thing that I'd like to improve. And when I make the goal, you know, the overall goal is to have a successful year, of course. And day to day, it's hard to achieve that goal every day because it's a large one, right? Same thing for anybody who's in continuing studies right now. You have a goal of a particular certificate or post a diploma that you'd like to be able to get. It's hard to complete it in one day, right? So it's like, how can you acknowledge yourself for the things that you are doing, and also, you know, bring grace and compassion to where you are individually in the larger climate of where we are as a university and where we are at in the world. You know, like, nobody had a guidebook on how to come out of COVID. We've never done it before. Many of us have never lived through a global pandemic, right? And so collectively, there's some grace and some growing pains on the institutional level, but also on the individual level. And maybe it's readjusting our goals and our expectations so that they don't deplete our energy that is already, you know, just trying to build back up since the cortisol was so strong for the last 2 years.
I might just jump in for a moment to say the findings that you presented, Chuck, of the Hugh report, like Siobhan, I'm not surprised, partially because when you add up all of the causes of burnout, you put someone in that environment, and then you add in the additional challenges faced by BIPOC individuals, microaggressions, like the list goes on, right? And so that is the perfect storm for creating the results that you mentioned, which is having higher rates of burnout. And I imagine additional challenges in being able to address that burnout. I know your part of your question was, you know, what can BIPOC individuals do? I'd like to shift that to what can organizations do to support BIPOC individuals? And Siobhan, I didn't know this about TMU, about the survey and report that was generated, created your role. So as I was thinking about it and reflecting on your comments, these are the very concrete things that organizations can do to support individuals, having roles like Siobhan's role present as one example, right? That's not the only thing, but that's one example.
Yeah, and I might just quickly jump in here as well, is that the onus so far in a lot of things about, you know, how do we address burnout? How do we address stress, fatigue, exhaustion? The onus has been on the individual. But the thing is, if you're already burned out, or if you're getting there, and this is something we call browning out, or if you're just exhausted, you don't need one more thing added onto your plate. And in fact, that adds to the guilt that Siobhan was referring to, which is like feeling sense of inadequacy, or feeling like, you know, oh, there's one more thing I have to do now to prevent this from happening. And also, if you are trying to advocate, if you're trying to champion for changes, you take on a lot of that. And part of that we don't talk about is the invisible emotional labor and the weight on your shoulders as you try and navigate this new territory, this new terrain. And so I very much support shifting that dialogue, but it doesn't necessarily, sometimes it's hard to say, okay, well, here we are, a few individuals, what can we do at the organizational level, right? And like, we can't take on all that change, but sometimes it's as simple as communicating, or the transparency, or the sharing of, you know, lived experiences. It's really that, how do we foster, whether through ourselves or championing for change, an environment where we feel included, where we feel like our voices are being heard, where things like a new position out of a report is, very much visible to the community, so that that your organization has your back and that they're looking into it and they care.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone, for your thoughts on this. Just being cognizant of the time, I do want to move on to our last sort of the main questions. And please continue to put your questions, everyone, into the chat. We will have a chance to get to a few of them today, hopefully. But, one of the main focus for this panel was sort of strategies for improving your mental wellness. So what are some strategies we can all use to alleviate burnout in school, at work, and at home? Anyone can start.
Yeah, I'll get the ball rolling on this one. So we all three of us, I think, collectively agree that at the individual level, it's challenging because it's one more thing to take on, but it doesn't mean that there's no work to be done, right? I think an important part of this is first acknowledging that work is work, and to set some healthy boundaries for yourself. Especially in a virtual environment, everything is communicated online. Sometimes we're bombarded by all these communications 24/7 all the time. And so setting some boundaries, some healthy sort of bumper stickers around yourself, and prioritizing yourself. I know that sometimes come with guilt, that sometimes come with feelings of inadequacy, or am I not doing enough? Am I just kind of languishing? Like, I'm not reaching my full capacity. Part of that work is to set that boundary. And I think that's an important one, at least at the individual level, that we can take on.
I was going to jump in, but Siobhan, it looks like you're speaking, but you're on mute. So go ahead first, and then maybe I'll talk after.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, just really quickly. I just wanted to say, Dr. Jenny or Dr. Liu, I'm not sure which one you prefer, but, I think that is so key and so critical, especially, the reality is like prioritizing ourselves, especially for people, if you're empathetic at all, like if you have 1 ounce of empathy, which the majority of us do because we are not diagnosed psychopaths, right? If you have 1 ounce of empathy, then it can become challenging to balance out all of the things that we love, or the people that we love and care about, and what we want to be giving as output. And I think that some of us, wherever you locate yourself in this conversation, chronically overgive and undergive to ourselves, recognizing that we're not machines. There's a way in which that we've been socialized, like in this culture, to operate almost like in a mechanized way. But I think when we look specifically at BIPOC communities, when we look specifically, through a feminine lens, whatever supports you, right, in your identities and all of that, I think it's important to look at how can we approach the things that we're doing on a day-to-day basis, sometimes leaning on traditional and ancestral knowledge, and bringing in unique ways to involve community, but simultaneously, continuing to push on the systemic structures that foster us working so individually at times, and can lead to the pitfall being burnout, right? I don't think it's how we're designed as human beings. I think we're social organisms and we're animals. We forget that sometimes, that we are animals that need adequate sleep, adequate sunlight, adequate food, adequate, social time, downtime, and give ourselves enough permission to do that. Like, we need to do that to recover from what we've experienced over the last 2 years. It's going to be, it's never going to be like it was. And there's a bit of grief that's associated with it. But how do we demonstrate enough resilience? And we'll get into some of those tools, but how can we demonstrate enough resilience and wherewithal to create a new structure that actually works for all of us?
So I'll jump in with a perspective that comes from healthcare, but I think a lot of the learning can be applied to other sectors in which you may be studying or you may be working in. And so within the last couple of years, we've had record-breaking levels of burnout amongst our health workforce. You've probably, if you've been to a hospital these days, you know it. You might work in it, but you certainly read about it. It's been all over popular media. We've done some looking at the research to say, well, what actually works when it comes to addressing burnout in these spaces. And so individuals can do all of the things that were mentioned. And often organizations will provide wellness supports, resilience training, and these things are all important and essential. But in the health workforce, to be able to really tackle burnout, we have to do interventions at that hospital or organization level, as well as the system level, which I know both of the previous speakers got into a little bit. And so things like staffing, like making sure you don't get overworked because you actually have enough of you to complete the work. That's something that's hard to tackle on your own. But that's something that the organization can do. And when you combine organizational interventions with individual level interventions, like all the wellness type of initiatives and resilience and on, that's when you have both effective interventions that address burnout, but they actually last. And so that's what I'll leave with is I think there's something that we can learn from the health workforce and in the health space that we can probably apply to other sectors as well.
Thank you so much. So just jumping into the Q&A, we just have time for maybe 2 questions, but there's a question here. Are there certain personality types that are more prone to burnout? For example, type A's or introverts?
I guess I'll get the ball rolling on this one, and I'll invite my colleagues to jump in here as well. So the area of personality typology is very messy, right? And a lot of the research is challenging in terms of replication, and that's like a whole can of worms. Like, I don't really want to get into too much today. We don't really have the time, but some of those factors, again, at the individual level, maybe they contribute to exhaustion or fatigue, but at a greater sense, I think what we want to focus on here is that if you don't feel connected to your community, to your organization you're in, that risk is that much greater. And you add in the lens of intersectionality and diversity and equity, is that the potential to feel not supported in your role in your everyday function is that much greater, because we haven't shifted the dialogue enough towards talking about support at an organizational, at a systems level. And so, yes, individually, perhaps there are kind of personality correlates or factors that make us care more or that make us want to do more in our roles. But the greater challenge here is still very much on, let's talk about the organization and the community and how we can better usher in that change.
Thank you.
We'll just quickly jump in then, and just from the health space, but what we could like to apply that more broadly. Not so much from a personality perspective, but we know that people are newer to their roles, newer to their jobs, and are still learning them, are more likely to become burnt out. Folks who work in stressful environments. In the health workforce, that's the intensive care unit and emergency departments, but like we all know in our various sectors, there's different environments in which are more stressful. And then finally, the last piece I'd say is those that feel like they have less control over their work.
Thank you. That all sounds true to me. So there's a question here in the chat about how does one respectfully set boundaries working in a corporation or organization without risking losing their job. And the second part is, especially if you're working in an environment that is not as multicultural. So you can answer to both parts or just the first part of the question.
So this is challenging, and this is something that I struggled a lot with in my previous roles as well, is that, what happens if it looks like you can't really put your foot down, right? If I say like, I'm only going to work 9 to 5, I'm not checking emails outside of that 9 to 5 window, and I want to take at least a 30-minute lunch, like don't bother me. And that boundary setting sometimes can be incremental. And so when you enforce boundaries on yourself, that's very drastic. It looks drastic to you and it looks drastic to those around you. And so when you're in an environment where change is, looks like micro steps and it's not as multicultural, as diverse, or as inclusive as you like, try to test out those baby steps, right? Gradual as opposed to drastic boundaries at an individual level is something that you can test out and negotiate. Right. So not necessarily, red flag drastic changes in your scheduling, but maybe you start to not respond to emails after a certain time and see how that goes. Right. Maybe you do take the full hour for lunch and see how that goes. Just those baby steps can gradually get you to a set of boundaries that both you and those around you get comfortable and acquainted with.
Thank you. So we have time for just one more quick question. And there's a lot of great questions in the chat. Someone's already asked for a part 2 of this, so thank you, everyone. But one of the questions is, can burnout lead to serious mental health challenges? Or maybe how would you know if it's sort of something even more serious?
Well, I can start on this one. So we do know that folks who become burnt out are at a higher risk for depression, as an example. And so if you are feeling signs of burnout, it is best to act on them if you can right away, because you don't want, the last thing you want is for it to progress to something worse. Now, there are formal resources in the community. If you're feeling like, I don't know if this is burnout, and if you're feeling, is this depression, is this burnout, but that's the time to reach out to a provider and have that discussion. I imagine at TMU that there are supports in place for students. For alumni, of course, there's your community supports like general physicians. And if you're feeling extremely like this is an emergency, there are emergency departments, but I would say if you're feeling burnt out, really try to address that before it gets any worse.
And something else that I just wanted to point to as a resource, there's some material I know that Truck and Barbara are going to forward to people interested from the panel, but just something informally that I found has been actually very effective is I've created some informal structures in my life to provide some additional support. So I have a Facebook group, like it's a small little group messenger with folks that identify as neurodiverse. I'm diagnosed with ADHD, so I have this group for the ADHD folks that I find when I double up, it's called body doubling. When I double up with another person, they don't even have to be with me, but if they're just on the camera, I become super effective at like doing the tasks that I need to get done. And so it's like really learning you and putting in things that like will make a difference, there's peer groups and things like that you can join as a one-to-one weekly session. I also want to just say to anybody, and feel free to reach out to me one-on-one or send me an email. Our contact information will be provided. If you are noticing that there's a gap, right? I'm happy to for something that you're looking for, something that would be a support to you. If you notice that there's a gap, then maybe it's also an opportunity that you can help to fill that gap for others. So it might be putting your hand up and 10 other people will say, I also identify as, being a parent who's in school, trying to forward my education. And then, you have this little group chat, and when you need somebody, you say, hey, I need help, and 10 people will see it, and one will probably respond to, address. So I think it's also broadening our reach, broadening our community, and leaning in inwards to understand who we are, so that we can then lean out to connect with the right and appropriate individuals. And that's like on an informal level. Of course, follow what Dr. Jillian was saying. If it's something that's more serious and you need more clinical support, reach out for that as well. And we can also forward some counseling resources for people that need a bit more concentrated efforts.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us this afternoon. And thank you everyone for attending today's event. Tomorrow, we will be sending out a curated list of mental wellness resources from TMU as well as our panelists, as well as a link to a recording of today's event. And I should mention that if you found this topic interesting, you may be interested in exploring courses in the Chang School's Certificate in Mental Health and Addictions. You can visit continuing.torontomu.ca to learn more about the certificate. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to contact us via email at ce@torontomu.ca. And we'll send up a follow-up email with this information as well as a survey. And then, the email will include a recording of the event and the resource document. So thank you everyone for attending. And on behalf of the Chang School at Toronto Metropolitan University, thank you for joining us today and have a great rest of your afternoon.